They say the Texas sun can burn a man's past right out of him. But for some, the heat only bakes the hatred deeper into the bone. In the summer of 1873, the town of Dusty Creek didn't see a man walk into that saloon. They saw a reckoning. He was draped in the color of midnight, with eyes that held the silence of 1,000 unmarked graves. Within 60 seconds, a man named Thomas Birch was dead before his head hit the floorboards, and the stranger had vanished back into the haze. The newspapers called him a monster. The law called him a shadow, but the people who had felt the lash and heard the chains, they called him vengeance. His name was Zachariah Creed. He was born in chains, forged in blood, and he didn't come back for his freedom. He already had that. He came back for the souls of the men who thought he'd stayed buried in the dirt of 1858. The story of Zachariah Creed does not begin with the weight of a pistol in his hand, but with the weight of the Texas sun pressing down on the Witmore Estate. In the year 1858, the air around Houston was thick with the scent of blooming cotton and the rot of a moral vacuum. Colonel Henry Witmore sat upon 3,000 acres of stolen soil, a man who wore a self-appointed military title as a shield for his cruelty. To the newspapers in New Orleans, he was a pillar of Southern prosperity and a gentleman of high standing. But to the 112 souls he claimed as property, he was a monster whose wealth was measured in scars. The prosperity of the Witmore name was built on a foundation of unmarked graves hidden behind the slave quarters. Zachariah was a child of this darkness, born in 1847 to a woman named Abigail whose only crime was a voice that sounded like heaven. Abigail was the domestic anchor of the main house, a woman who sang old spirituals about Moses and the Promised Land while she scrubbed floors. She gave her son the name Zachariah in the dead of night, whispering that it meant, God remembers. So he would never forget his worth. She told him that every tear shed into the Texas dirt was being recorded by a higher power who would one day make it right. To young Zachariah, his mother's voice was the only beautiful thing in a world defined by the jagged edges of survival. It was a fragile piece, held together by hushed prayers and the flickering light of a single tallow candle. The fragility of that world shattered on a Tuesday in August when the heat reached a brutal, shimmering 100 degrees. Abigail was carrying a heavy ceramic jug of milk through the dining room when her sweat-slicked palms betrayed her, and the vessel splintered against the floor. The sound of breaking clay brought Mrs. Witmore into the room, a woman whose irascibility was as sharp as the colonel's whip. She did not see an accident. She saw a provocation, a stain on her polished wood that required a sacrifice of blood. She called for Thomas Birch, the head overseer, a man who found a perverse, smiling joy in the application of pain. Birch was a man who lived for the moment the leather met the skin, a butcher masquerading as a disciplinarian. Zachariah was sweeping the front path when his mother's first scream pierced the heavy afternoon air, a sound that bypassed his brain and went straight to his feet. He ran toward the backyard, ignoring the rules that forbade him from the main house, only to find a scene of calculated horror. His mother was stripped to the waist and bound to a wooden post while the Witmore family watched from the shade of a pecan tree. Mrs. Witmore fanned herself with a slight, bored smile, treating the impending violence as nothing more than a mid-day entertainment. An overseer's hand clamped onto Zachariah's shoulder, forcing the boy to stand still and bear witness to the ritual. "Watch, boy," the man hissed. "Watch what happens when you people forget your place in this world." Then came the whip, a braided leather serpent with metal weights that tore the air with a wet, rhythmic snap. Zachariah counted every stroke, 37 in total, as his mother's screams faded into a low, guttural moaning, and finally into a terrifying silence. He watched the red map of Texas being carved into her dark skin, her body going limp against the post, while Birch wiped the sweat from his brow. When the colonel finally nodded in approval, the family walked back inside to finish their dinner, leaving the broken woman to rot in the sun. That was the moment the boy named Zachariah died. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, and he didn't pray. He simply donned a mask of stone, and in the void where his heart used to be, something cold and metallic began to grow. The systematic destruction of Zachariah's world continued in 1859, when the colonel decided that human flesh was worth more than family bonds. A slave trader named William Crawford arrived at the gates in a polished carriage, eyes scanning the quarters like a wolf at a sheepfold. Zachariah watched from the shadows as the two men bartered over his 6-year-old sister, Grace, checking her teeth and muscles as if she were livestock. The deal was struck for $400, a pittance for the light of a brother's life, and Grace was thrown into a wagon. As the wheels began to turn, she reached out her small, trembling hands, screaming Zachariah's name until an overseer's rifle butt silenced the boy. He woke up in the dirt with a fractured skull and a hollow chest, realizing that his sister was now a ghost. With his mother in the ground and his sister lost to the deep south, Zachariah found his only solace in a boy named Samuel. Samuel was a year older, a soul who possessed a defiant light that the plantation's darkness could not seem to extinguish. While Zachariah nursed a growing fever of hatred, Samuel spoke of an internal peace that no white man could ever take away. They whispered of the North, of the free states, and of the territories out west where a man might own his own breath. These were not just dreams, they were the oxygen that kept their lungs moving through the grueling 16-hour days in the cotton fields. They promised each other that they would leave this hell together, finding grace and building a life where the whip was only a memory. However, the natural order of the Witmore Estate demanded a final sacrifice on a freezing night in December of 1860. Samuel, driven by a hunger that gnawed at his very bones, had stolen a single piece of bread to feed a sick child. To Colonel Witmore, this was not an act of mercy, but a capital offense against the sanctity of his personal property. The entire plantation was gathered under the skeletal branches of a great pecan tree to witness the ultimate price of theft. Thomas Birch placed the noose around Samuel's neck with a practiced, indifferent hand, ensuring the drop was shallow enough to prolong the agony. Zachariah was forced to stand in the front row, his eyes locked onto his friend's face as the life was slowly strangled out. For 3 days, the colonel ordered Samuel's body to remain hanging as a rotting monument to the consequences of disobedience and perceived sin. Zachariah walked past his friend every morning and evening, watching the crows descend and the winter wind whistle through the tattered clothes. On the third night, when the moon hid behind a heavy shroud of clouds, the boy finally snapped the last of his invisible chains. He crept to the blacksmith's shed, stole a rusted knife, and cut Samuel down from the tree with the reverence of a priest. He spent hours digging into the frozen earth with his bare, bleeding hands until he could tuck his friend away from the birds. He didn't offer a prayer to a god who allowed such things, but he made a vow to the soil. Zachariah ran that night, pushing through the western fence with nothing but a stolen knife and a heart turned into a compass of rage. He had no supplies, no map, and no knowledge of the world beyond the Witmore fence line, only the desperate instinct to be free. Behind him, he heard the low, guttural baying of the hounds and the shouts of professional slave catchers who made their living on human misery. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, eventually finding a narrow hole in a dry creek bank. As the dogs circled above his hiding spot, sniffing the air with murderous intent, Zachariah held his breath in the damp rot of the earth. The hunters eventually moved on, leaving behind a 13-year-old shadow who was no longer a boy, but a fugitive of fate. The wilderness of West Texas was a secondary master, one that did not use a whip, but punished every mistake with the threat of death. For 3 years, Zachariah lived as a ghost in a land of scrub brush and sun, bleached bone, far beyond the reach of the Colonel's laws. He learned to read the sky like a map and the earth like a book, identifying the subtle signs of water hidden beneath dry beds. This landscape was brutal and indifferent, offering no comfort to a boy who had spent his life under the thumb of men. He moved through the canyons with the silence of a mountain lion, his skin darkening and his muscles hardening into iron. The transition from a fugitive child to a frontier survivor was forged in the isolation of the high desert winds. Survival required a primal education that no plantation could provide, forcing Zachariah to master the art of the hunt with primitive tools. He spent his days crafting traps from scavenged vines, and his nights shivering in the hollows of limestone caves to escape the blue northers. Every plant was scrutinized for its medicinal properties or its potential to poison, a knowledge base built through the agony of trial and error. He learned to strike fire from flint and steel, a small flicker of light that served as his only companion in the vast darkness. He became a student of the predators, watching how they moved and mirrored their patience to secure a meager meal of rabbit or snake. The soft parts of his soul were burned away by the relentless sun, replaced by a cold, calculating instinct for endurance. The frontier was also a crossroads of dangerous men, where a black youth with no papers was viewed as either prey or a potential prophet. Zachariah encountered outlaws, Mexican traders, and Comanche parties, learning to gauge their intentions long before they stepped into the light of his fire. He learned that the law of the gun was the only law that truly mattered in the territories where the government's shadow did not reach. He was no longer a piece of property to be traded, but a free agent in a world that demanded a high price for that freedom. His first killings were not acts of malice, but the desperate responses of a creature backed into a corner by those who sought his return. Each life he took added a layer of ice to his heart, distancing him further from the boy who had once wept for Samuel. The physical toll of this life was etched into his body in the form of jagged scars and a constant, watchful tension in his eyes. He survived the venomous bite of a rattlesnake by cutting the poison from his own flesh, a feat of willpower that would have broken a lesser man. He endured winters where the air turned to needles of ice, wrapping himself in the skins of the animals he had killed to stay alive. There were days when hunger was his only constant, a gnawing reminder of the vulnerability he had sworn to overcome after the death of his mother. He no longer saw himself as a victim of the Witmore Estate, but as a weapon being sharpened by the very elements of the earth. The transformation was nearly complete. He was a vessel waiting to be filled with the specific skills of a professional warrior. By the age of 15, Zachariah Creed had become a legend in his own mind, a shadow that the Texas authorities could never quite pin down. He had outlived the slave catchers and outsmarted the environment, proving that his spirit was far more resilient than the chains that once held him. His identity was now tied to the land itself, a rugged expanse of freedom that offered no apologies and expected no mercy in return. He looked toward the eastern horizon with a gaze that could pierce through the haze of memory. Focusing on the names he still carried, the wilderness had given him his life back, but it had also prepared him for the singular purpose of taking the lives of others. He was a man-made storm, ready to break upon the world of those who thought they had destroyed him. In the spring of 1863, a dying Zachariah collapsed into the camp of Joaquin Esperanza, a man who was himself a ghost of the Mexican-American War. Joaquin was a legendary outlaw who had staged his own death 3 times to escape the reach of 2 different governments and countless bounty hunters. He looked into the boy's hollow, burning eyes and saw a reflection of the same murderous resolve that had once fueled his own bloody youth. Instead of turning the intruder away, the old gunman recognized a debt he owed to the universe for his own survival years prior. He offered the boy a piece of roasted rabbit and a choice die in the dirt as a victim or live as a dealer of death. Zachariah chose the path of the killer, and for the next 4 years, the remote canyon became his academy of violence. The first year of his education was a brutal reconstruction of the physical body, designed to erase the last vestiges of the plantation slave. Joaquin was a heartless instructor who believed that lessons bought with pain were the only ones that would stick when the bullets began to fly. He taught Zachariah the art of the knife, the balance of the staff, and the silent, bone-breaking techniques of the Comanche and the vaqueros. They sparred until the boy's knuckles were raw and his ribs were bruised, forcing him to find strength in the marrow of his own endurance. Every movement was stripped of wasted energy, turning the teenager into a fluid machine of muscle and redirected momentum that could kill with a single strike. By the end of the year, Zachariah no longer walked like a man in hiding, but like a predator claiming his territory. The second phase of training introduced the mechanical god of the frontier, the revolver, an instrument that required both a steady hand and a deadened heart. Joaquin taught him that a gun was not a tool of bravado, but a precise extension of one's own will that demanded absolute, cold-blooded focus. Zachariah practiced his draw until the motion of leather on steel was a blurred whisper, faster than the blink of a startled eye. He learned to shoot at targets while sprinting through uneven terrain, while hanging from the side of a horse, and while his mentor fired live rounds at his feet. He was taught to clear a jammed cylinder in total darkness and to feel the weight of every grain of black powder in his hand. The boy who had once trembled at a master's voice now held the power to silence any voice from 50 paces away. Beyond the mechanics of the draw, Joaquin imparted the psychological warfare necessary to survive a campaign against men who held the law in their pockets. He taught Zachariah how to read a room before entering it, how to spot the twitch of a nervous hand, and how to use the shadows as a tactical ally. Vengeance, the old man warned, was a fire that would eventually consume the one who lit it, leaving no room for the luxury of a peaceful future. He insisted that Zachariah learn to speak with the calm, terrifying authority of a man who has already decided his opponent is dead. They spent nights discussing the anatomy of fear, learning how to break a man's spirit with a look long before a finger ever touched the trigger. Zachariah absorbed these lessons with a grim hunger, seeing each technique as a key to a door he had long been waiting to open. By 1867, the transformation was complete, and the boy who had fled the Witmore Estate was replaced by the most dangerous man in the territories. Zachariah stood tall and broad-shouldered, his dark skin a contrast to the twin revolvers that hung low and heavy against his hips. Joaquin looked at his student and felt a profound sadness, knowing he had created a masterpiece of destruction that could never truly return to the world of men. The mentor gave him a final gift, a pair of custom-tooled holsters and a horse that could outrun the wind, before telling him to leave the canyon forever. There was no celebratory farewell, only the silent acknowledgement of two ghosts passing in the night as Zachariah turned his horse toward the east. The training was over, the weapons were loaded, and the names on his list were finally about to face their maker. The 18th-man campaign of vengeance began not with a shout, but with the cold, rhythmic click of a hammer being pulled back in the shadows. Zachariah Creed moved across the Texas landscape like a localized storm, appearing in saloons and remote outposts to collect debts that had aged for over a decade. He was no longer a man, he was a force of nature dressed in black, carrying a ledger of names written in the blood of his memory. Each confrontation followed a terrifying pattern of surgical precision, where the target was faced with their sins before being sent into the void. The newspapers began to whisper of a black ghost, who moved with a speed that defied the limits of human reflex. He did not rob his victims or boast of his deeds, leaving behind only spent shell casings and a silence that felt heavier than the heat. The killing of Thomas Birch in the Dusty Creek saloon was the spark that set the rest of the prairie on fire. Birch, who had grown old and soft on the profits of his cruelty, never saw the dark hand that reached for the revolver until it was too late. Zachariah stood before him for a single, eternal second, ensuring the overseer recognized the eyes of the boy who had watched his mother die. The gunshot was a thunderclap that echoed through the halls of every plantation house in the region, signaling that the past had finally caught up. Word spread through the underworld of slave catchers and former overseers, a cold dread settling over those who had once wielded the whip. They began to huddle in groups, hiring guards and barricading doors, but Zachariah moved through their defenses like smoke through a keyhole. One by one, the names were crossed off with a finality that shook the foundations of the local law enforcement. William Crawford, the man who had sold Zachariah's sister into the abyss of the Deep South, was found dead in a Houston hotel with a single coin left on his chest. The hunter moved with a patience that was as lethal as his aim, waiting for the perfect moment when his prey felt most secure before striking. He utilized the terrain he had mastered in the wilderness, turning the very brush and canyons into tactical advantages that left the posses baffled. Each man who fell was a link in the chain that had bound Zachariah, and with every hammer fall, he felt the weight of his own history becoming lighter. The campaign was a masterpiece of focused rage, a long-delayed ritual of justice that the state of Texas would never be able to forget. The final destination was the Witmore Estate, which had fallen into a state of decayed grandeur as the old world of the South crumbled. Colonel Henry Witmore sat on his porch, a hollow shell of a man who still clung to a title that had never been earned in battle. He watched the rider approach through the shimmering heat of the cotton fields, realizing that the property he had once broken was now the master of his fate. There was no grand speech or plea for mercy that could bridge the gap of the decades of suffering that lay between the two men. Zachariah dismounted with a grace that was terrifying in its stillness, the twin revolvers at his hips gleaming like the eyes of a wolf. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the heavy, metallic tang of an impending and inevitable slaughter. The reckoning was swift, ending the era of the Witmore name with the same indifferent violence that the colonel had once used on Abigail. As the sun set over the Texas horizon, the plantation was left to the ghosts and the wind, the debt finally paid in full. Zachariah Creed did not stay to watch the smoke rise. He turned his horse toward the setting sun, riding back into the legend from which he had emerged. He remained the most feared gunslinger in the territory, a man who had proved that the spirit cannot be owned, only temporarily delayed. His story survived in the hushed whispers of the quarters and the fearful stories of the lawmen, a reminder that some crimes are too heavy for the earth to bury. He rode until he was nothing more than a silhouette against the orange sky, a free man who had finally found his peace in the smoke.